We are going to continue to analyze the literacy behaviors we saw David use as we talk about the implications for ELLs as they use all three cueing systems. As we look at David's miscue analysis, we are going to consider as we go how our lens might be modified when we look at the reading errors and cueing systems ELLs use. We'll discuss what might and might not transfer between other languages and English, and we will also walk through strategies or tips for how to support English learners appropriately with their reading skills. Most of the information included in this section is from the book titled Teaching Reading to English Language Learners by Herrera, Perez, and Escamilla. It's a great resource. I'd encourage you to see if there are copies of it in your schools. We are going to draw our attention to the miscue table that you completed after you watched the video of David reading. Pause this video again briefly and answer the questions on the slide. Really, we're looking at what trends did you notice for David as you did the miscue analysis. What cueing systems were used the most? Those would probably be strengths. What were some next steps? Maybe what cueing systems were partially used or least used. Take a moment and do this reflective work and then resume the video. Before we move on, please pull up the Running Records and ELLs handout that is linked in your agenda. This was compiled using the text you see on the slide. Follow along as we walk through each cueing system and some of the implications for English language learners. Syntax and structure is often the area that ELLs make the most mistakes in, and it's often the cueing system they use the least. This makes sense if you think about how language progresses through the proficiency levels and the complexity of sentences in proficiency levels as compared to text. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But for the moment, take a pause and read through the main points on this slide. Then I will highlight a few key areas when you resume. One of the main things we see English language learners do is that they will take a different approach to new words sometimes based on their first language. One example of this might be word order. For example, a student might swap the noun and the adjective placement in a sentence, especially if grammatically this is how it occurs in their home language. When this occurs, sometimes we think the student is not paying attention to the visual system, and then we focus on or overemphasize the visual system with them, when actually they are making a transfer from their first language. In the latter case, it would be better to focus on syntax with them, instead of just talking with them about how the word looks and doesn't look visually. We'd want to let them know that English is different maybe than their first language grammatically, and that the adjective goes before the noun instead of after the noun. Another thing that is common that English learners can do sometimes is that they substitute prepositions for other prepositions or other words that they might know or that exist in their language. An example of this might be a student reads the word on as en. Keep in mind, en in Spanish is the same word for in and on in English, which may give us an explanation for why the student made this substitution. Again, it's important to know this because it will change our approach. We might actually think the root cause is they don't know their sight words, in and on. That may be a piece and one way to approach it. However, the root cause might more be linked to the syntax and their first language transfer than a sight word issue. Knowing the root cause changes our focus of instruction. We may have just focused on sight word memorization when really what the student might need is direct instruction about the nuances of words from one language to the next. An important skill for helping students with syntax and to use the system more is to provide lots and lots of oral language practice. That way they can use the grammatical syntax of the new language they are learning as they read. It's been said, if you can't say it, it will be difficult to read it and then write it correctly. Another important piece pertaining to syntax is to consider a student's language proficiency level and the sentence complexity that they are able to hang on to at their level, and how much that connects or does not connect with the complexity of the text. Pause in just a moment to look at the WIDA performance definitions that are linked in your agenda. Look closely at level 1 and 2 as David is in this range for reading. Look at the sentence level. What do you notice about the performance definitions in the text? Pause the video and consider the questions on the slide as you look at the performance definitions, the text, and what David was able to do as a reader. Then resume and we will hit a few of the highlights. You'll notice that with David, that he was able to be successful with a lot of the repetitive structures that were in the text. This matches with the WIDA level too. The text has some repetition, and David seems to do well and make less errors in the parts that repeat. When the sentence goes beyond that repetition, or when the sentences go beyond simple sentences, he often struggles more. It is often helpful to consider how an ELL's sentence complexity level lines up or does not line up with the complexity of a text. We often see correlations to that and where breakdown starts to happen, like with David. The syntax queuing system demands more from the reader as they move ahead in further reading levels. Beyond the earlier text levels, there are different types of sentences in text of varying complexity, which you will notice on the performance definitions as at much higher levels than a 1 or 2. This is why it is so important to give students lots of oral language practice with increasing sentence complexity, so they are able to hold on to that structure as they read text as well. Thinking about what you have just learned around the common lenses to think about syntax, which are listed on the left column of this slide. Pause again, read and remind yourself about those, and jot some notes around your thinking as you look at David. Do you see any of those common errors mentioned on the left column of the slide? Once you've thought through that, check your thinking on the synthesis part of the exemplar under Syntax, Strengths, Next Steps, and Supports. Resume the video once you have done this, so we can hit some of the key points. One of the things that we see with English learners is that there might be a substitution of a more general word versus using a specific word. You'll notice this with David as it ties to vocabulary. When he is more familiar with the vocabulary, he is more successful with the syntax and grammar of the sentence as well. Another thing that we saw with David is that idea of there's a different approach to words based on the first language. For example, in Spanish, when students conjugate and use the past tense, they use different endings. You'll notice that he left off the ed sound in asked. This is not a common way that past tense is utilized in his first language, so he's using a different approach to the word. As a teacher, we may jump right to focusing on the visual system with David and having him pay attention visually to the word. And that is not bad, and we can still do that. But we might want to think about how we can balance that opportunity with an opportunity to also focus on oral language and developing his syntax. Probably the biggest support that would benefit David is that overall need for more oral language practice so that he can internalize the syntactical structures of more complex English. That will then make it easier for him to read more complex English. Let's move on to the visual cueing system now. This cueing system is the one that is many times the most heavily emphasized in classrooms, as well as on students in the earlier grade levels and with new learners of English. Again, that is not a bad thing, and students need to use their visual cueing system. Take a moment and pause the screencast so that you can read through the main points on this slide. Then I will highlight some of the areas when you resume. One of the key pieces for English language learners as they use the visual cueing system is that they may often become confused with phonics because of the sound or phonological differences between their language and English. Some sounds exist in English that do not exist in other languages. It will be much harder for students to make the sounds, to segment and blend them, if they are not familiar with them from their first language. They will need more practice with these sounds. For example, the TH sound, th, does not exist in all languages. Lots of times you'll notice students substituting this sound for the D sound. This is one example of a sound that you may have to practice more intensely with English language learners, especially if it does not exist in their primary language. You can see some other examples on the slide. Finally, One of the things to remember is that high frequency words are related to the visual cueing system. Oftentimes, students may leave off the smaller high frequency words like the that have less meaning tied to them. Remember that quote I told you to remember, meaning is everything? Well, this connects back to that. Those little high frequency words that don't carry a lot of meaning are often very hard for students to memorize, again, because it's harder to make a connection to what it means. Students may need actual more practice with these shorter words than with some of the longer words, especially if the meaning is not as evident. You may also want to think about how you could tie them to meaning. Some key strategies to support students with the visual cueing system is that we should practice decoding skills with students with meaning versus in isolation or nonsense words. That means when students are segmenting and blending words, we would want to use words that they know in English already. They know the meaning of them. It's very hard to blend words together if you don't have that word in your existing vocabulary. Also, remember, as we said before, they're going to need extra oral rehearsal of sounds in English that don't transfer between their language and English. And keep in mind with that, if they can identify sounds and letters that are common in both languages, but have difficulty with others, the problem may be more related to an issue with a language transfer than with phonics itself. Thinking about what you just learned around common lenses to think about with visual, read the questions on the slide and pause the screencast. Jot some notes around this as you think about David. Then check your thinking on the synthesis part of the exemplar under the visual. What did you notice with David as it relates to common errors for ELLs with visuals? How might you think about supporting him? Pause and do that thinking work now. Just to highlight a couple of things, you will notice that David struggled with the blends SK and GL in the words sky and glider. This is a good example of language transfer. Those two blends do not exist in the Spanish language, so it is much harder to blend those in English. This doesn't mean he cannot do it, it just means we may need to focus our instruction a little more around these pieces. The last cueing system to discuss is the meaning system. This is different than the overall comprehension of text. This is more about thinking what makes sense in the context of the sentence and in that moment as reading is occurring. This is the system actually most commonly used by most English learners. Again, meaning is everything. Take a moment and pause the screencast to read through the main points on the slide. Then I'll highlight a few areas when you resume. You'll notice that the way to support meaning really does tie back to what we talked about with supporting comprehension. Vocabulary and background knowledge or schema are the biggest tools. This also ties back to the 5+3 components of reading. Remember that background knowledge was a key part of that +3, and vocabulary should also be targeted throughout the sequence. Increasing supports around these pieces are going to increase the use of a student's meaning cueing system. Often, if a student does not use meaning, it might be because the word is not in their English vocabulary, or they don't have enough experience in their background or prior learning. Meaning really is everything, which is why ELLs use this system most. They are searching for that making sense piece. However, if they don't yet have something to draw from, schema or vocab around the concept, they may not be able to make appropriate use of this system. Thinking about what you have just learned around common lenses to think about meaning, read the questions on the slide and pause the screencast to connect this to what you notice with David. Then check your thinking on the synthesis part of the exemplar under meaning. A key thing to note here is that vocabulary seems to be a special place that we would want to target for David. He self-corrects when the word is in his vocabulary. He never self-corrects for hang glider or balloon fully, because maybe those words are not in his English vocabulary or background knowledge yet. The biggest support for David to use the meaning system more will be increasing his vocabulary development. Take a moment and consider this question. How did you see all of the aspects, the 5+3 components of reading intertwined with the 3